Minasama konnichiwa. Good afternoon, everybody. It's wonderful to be here and to be reunited with an old and good friend, Joey Ito, who, as I said to some people at my table at lunch, is sort of a mezurashi Nihonjin, kind of a special Japanese, because in so many ways he kind of embodies the biculturalism that we all are looking for when we talk about sort of globalization in the 21st century. Empowerment and social change within Japan have always been sort of intriguing subjects to me, especially during my years living in Japan. And especially for a nation that once seemed destined to become the world's technology leader in so many fields, and then fell into a lost decade of malaise and stagnation from which it is still trying to recover, and for which the problems of the past year in Japan have thrown into even greater relief. I published a book now 5 years ago, Shutting Out the Sun, my one little plug, still in paperback, that tried to explain how Japan had fallen off the track, if you will, and why it was so hard for this proud and important country to regain its stride. I argued there that more than its unique economic system or propensity to save and think for the longer term, Japan was burdened by a unique social psychology of conformism and interdependent thinking that was perfectly suited to the world of large institutions, mass production, and hardware, but that was probably ill-suited for the emerging era of personalization, customization, and, if you will, software. America, by contrast, is a uniquely anarchic, individualistic society. So in the emerging era of individual empowerment, I argued, Japan might need a major software upgrade. In the years since the book came out, of course, I've increasingly had to add a cautionary note, which is that since my book was published, just as fiber to the home was really taking off and gaining momentum in Japan, and that keitai, or cell phone culture, was just also being launched, that there was maybe the possibility that fast-moving, institution-busting creativity that the internet brings might unleash an effect in Japan not unlike that which was going on in the United States and other developing countries. Even though Japan has been a country that, as we know, has been a somewhat hostile environment over the years for entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship, and has tended to favor the large institution over the small startup. Now, of course, Twitter, Facebook, new social media have also entered the equation, and probably with differential impact in a country like Japan or a country like China than we would see in the US and Europe. So it's a really wonderful moment to have Joey Ito here with us today, to talk about the internet and how it changes the world and its implications for Japan. He's a bicultural Japanese in the truest sense of the word, and I think we all know in this room that plenty of tech pioneers like Steve Jobs or Bill Gates succeeded without ever finishing college, but it's also pretty unusual for a college dropout like Joey to be named head of an important academic institution, i.e. the MIT Media Lab, which he joined in September, since it's one of the nation's most visible positions that links cutting-edge technology and media innovation. I worked for quite a long time in Silicon Valley, so I've watched Joey and known Joey for many years. And he's always really been that unusual, truly bicultural Japanese who understood the hacker culture of the Valley and the politics of the open source movement, but was still undeniably Japanese. He's helped found digital companies. He's launched incubator funds to seed good tech ideas across Asia. He's been instrumental in the Creative Commons movement and affiliated with the Berkman Center for Internet and Society at Harvard. At a time when Japan is still reeling from environmental crisis and political dysfunction, the question of the internet's ability to empower and direct change is a critically important issue, and I think there's probably no one better to address that subject for us than our speaker, Joey Ito.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that flattering introduction. And I always feel odd speaking at the Japan Society because it collapses two of the cultures that are usually mostly separate in my head. But I'll first talk a little bit about, so talking about open networks, I'm really talking about the internet. And I can separate my life to two halves, or they're not actually half now that I'm older, but before the internet and after the internet. And just as the internet was emerging, I think I was in my teens and 20s working in Japan, working for NHK, working with some trading companies. And I'm 45 right now. And I remember doing a quick analysis that it would be 45 years old before I could do anything important in Japan. So the Japanese lawyers, bengoshi, they write opinions when they become 45. In a trading company, typically you become sort of bucho level, own budget, 45. NHK, having your own show, about 45. 45 years old, I don't have kids, unfortunately, yet. I'm trying. But 45-year-olds typically have wives, kids, homes. You can't take risk at 45, you know. And so I saw this as a fundamental problem in the way that the Japanese system was, which was by the time you got old enough to actually have power, you weren't able to actually put that power to risk. And so I had been thinking about this a lot. And when I saw the internet, so I was working in media, televisions, motion pictures, and again, all of these things, motion pictures, newspapers, required you to be in an institution. And I was thinking, okay, do I want to be a television producer? Do I want to be become a journalist? But I thought of all these years I would have to put in to climb this ladder, and all these ojigis that I would have to do, and you know, I didn't mind it, but I just thought, I'm in the peak. I'm creative now. I want to do something now, and I'm a very impatient guy. And so when I saw the internet, something really changed in my brain, and I realized that this was a place where you didn't have to have permission, and you didn't have to. Everyone could connect, and actually, it was. Being young was actually better than being older, because the less you knew, the more creative you could be. So I helped build the first internet service provider in Japan, was his first CEO. And I remember there were Japanese academics saying the internet was illegal and people didn't like it. And you know, back then, if you remember, I'm sure some of you might remember, you couldn't connect a device to the telephone system without a stamp from, you know, Japanese government, and without NTT's approval. Everything was closed. And what the internet said was, anyone can connect and anyone can hack. So what happened was the old telephone systems that were built by these big telephone companies were very expensive and were monopolies. Suddenly you had small startups like 3Com and Cisco building the devices, and you had small companies building the internet service providers to compete with the telephone system. And the battle, just to define it back then, there was a competing system to the internet. It was called X25. And X25 was another packet switching network that was similar to the internet, but different in a major way. And so, so there's a system, and again, I'm going to assume not everyone here is technical, but and I apologize if this is oversimplifying it, but you have a thing called standards, right? So standards are specifications against which you build technology. There's a standards body that's currently called the ITU, that was back then called CCITT, but it hangs off of the United Nations, and it's an intergovernmental agency. And what happens is people go there wearing neckties, being very kind of formal, and and the experts come from the companies and the governments, and they discuss every possible risk and every possible use. And when you're building infrastructure, it's very important, because it's hard. You can't change it very easily after you've built it. But it turns out with networks and software, you can change it. And so the time that was spent creating the specification for X25 was tremendous. And what happens when you have all this time poured into it is you create tremendous complexity. So the specification to create an X25 system was like this high. And so only big companies could create it. It cost a lot of money, and it was basically overspecified. You know, all the people had to have accounts. Every packet was billed, and the internet guys, on the other hand, first of all, it wasn't intergovernmental, and the guy, and what they had was they had this credo called rough consensus running code, which was, let's just kind of figure out what we want to do, and then build it, and keep it simple, and then let's iterate on it. Let's let it evolve. So what happened was the specifications around the internet typically were very skimpy. They were called RFCs, requests for comment. It's a very humble thing. And you'd build something, and then you'd modify it, and you'd modify it, and you'd modify it. And so what happened was that the people who built stuff for the internet were these small groups of 2 or 3 people. David Weinberger uses the phrase, small pieces loosely joined. So the internet was built by small pieces, small groups, loosely joined by standards created in ad hoc committees that were not part of some intergovernmental agency. Any 12-year-olds could participate, and it was all done on the internet. And the internet won, as we all know. And in Japan, for a while, there was a struggle. When Jun Murai was building a lot of the early technology at the internet, people were betting against the internet. They were trying to build this X25 network. But the internet won because it was faster, and it turned out that creating small systems and allowing them to evolve worked well enough that you didn't have to sit and specify everything. So what happened when you did that was that the costs went down. First of all, the costs of computing were going down anyway through Moore's law and the computer chip going down. But because you were allowed to compete, and it forced competition at every layer, and also because it enabled this explosion of open source software and free software, that the cost of creating products and services, the cost of distributing these products and services, and the cost of collaboration went down to nearly zero. So if you look at venture capital, it went from, say, $10 million, $20 million to do an average startup in the software industry to today, almost zero, but definitely less than $1 million to get what I would call a minimum viable product out. Because today, when you go to the internet, you say, okay, billing system, well, we've got 10 different billing systems we could use. Login system, oh, we'll just use this open source software. Every single component on the internet's already there. You just, if you want to build Twitter, you just build that piece that you want, and you can find all the other pieces on the internet. This is, again, the small pieces loosely joined. We use the term agile a lot, which is the ability to create a minimum viable product very quickly, often over a weekend, and then you launch it very quickly, and then you iterate on it. And so it's changed venture capital fundamentally to angel investors, and then now with open source, a lot of cases, you don't even need an investment. I'm on the board of the Mozilla Foundation. We make over $100 million a year, and it's a nonprofit, and Wikipedia, one of the top 5 websites in the world, was built without any funding, completely in the open, same with Linux. So some of the greatest assets we have on the internet today didn't even require funding. But what happens is that when you lower the cost of innovation, it fundamentally changes the nature of innovation. Because if you think, for instance, Wikipedia, if this were in any of our companies here, in Japanese companies, and somebody said, I'm going to create an encyclopedia that's better than Encyclopedia Britannica, and the way we're going to do it is let anybody edit the page. You would never fund this project, right? It sounds like a stupid idea. And in fact, just about every successful internet company, when it first starts out, kind of sounds like a stupid idea. And you would never bet $100 million on it. And the problem is, for a Japanese telephone company to, what I would say, swing the bat, to set up a jigyobu, to invest the money, to think about it, to do the feasibility study, costs about $100 million. For a smaller company, like a trading company, probably $10 million. But you're still talking about millions of dollars to try out an idea. Whereas in venture capital, the most money you lose is the money you invested, right? So venture capitalists today, for $100,000, can test or $10,000 can test an idea. So what you do is you don't sit around and worry about whether this is a good idea or a bad idea. You just let them do it. Or in most cases, they'll do it with their own money. And then afterwards, what you do is you spend time nurturing those things that grow. Another way of saying that is that the time, so like when I worked in Japan, it was very frustrating. I was working with a company trying to pitch them an idea, and the total cost of the idea was probably several $100,000. But they set up a feasibility study company, SF Gaisha, and spent about $3 million trying to decide to eventually not do this project that would have only cost them several $100,000. And to me, that's the kind of problem that we have in Japan in particular, but generally in the world, where the map has gotten so complex that it's really, really difficult to predict the future. And the cost of trying things has gotten so cheap that it really doesn't make sense to try to figure out whether it's a good idea or not. It actually makes a lot of sense to try it, and then we call it iterating. And this iterating is actually, if you look at the roots of what's considered agile software development in Japan, you can trace the roots all the way back to Japan, because it all starts in the sort of Kanban Hoshiki, just-in-time manufacturing, where the Toyotas of the world only had a very, very short inventory, so that when they found something wrong, the only thing they had to throw away was that short amount of inventory. This is exactly the same way that internet startups in Silicon Valley work. They don't stock a lot of code, and they're always pivoting, and they're always changing. And the idea is to not invest a lot of money in each sprint. So each sprint is like one release, is typically a week or 2 weeks. And then they look around, and sometimes they'll take 80% of their code and dump it and go in another direction. So if you look at 2005, I think, YouTube was a dating site, deaike site with video. The first thing you did in YouTube was name, male or female, looking for men, women, everything, and that was YouTube 2005. If they had sat and tried to perfect it over 2 years instead of being agile, they would never have been successful. What they did is they launched that, it didn't work. They turned it into Flickr with video. That didn't work. And they said, oh, we're going to become the video embed thing for MySpace. And that worked. And the idea of pivoting around and being very agile without knowing, so that the idea is it's not planned. You have what I would say a compass. So you have a general trajectory. We want to be massively scaled and we want to be in video. But how exactly you get there, you figure out as you go along. And I think that the problem with a lot of larger enterprises that have focused so much on mitigation of risk is that they focus too much time on trying to map everything out. And a lot of Japanese companies that I know, that I've worked in, your whole week is teireikai, is regular meetings. We've got the monthly blah, blah, blah meeting and the weekly blah, blah, blah meeting. And so your whole day is filled with meetings that are pre-planned and the same every single month. And then what's really important is that, so John Seeley Brown, who used to run Xerox PARC, has this great book called The Power of Pull. And John Seeley Brown says that what you need to do is you need to be well networked and pull the resources as you need them. And it's, again, very Japanese, kind of just in time. And don't stock resources and don't centrally control. So the old way of doing it is to stock money, control, power, knowledge, and push it from the center out. But he said, no, you innovate on the edges, pull things together as you need them, and he uses the word embrace serendipity. And this is a lot of how the internet startups work as well, is you chart a general trajectory, you look around for what you have, you happen to be sitting next to this guy, you happen to just have met this guy, you put that together, you try it out, you push it, does it work, you do the next thing. And you can't have serendipity if everything is planned. If you have a teireikai every single day, you're not going to get lucky. Because if you plan everything, you can't be lucky, and you need a lot of luck. And I think that's another problem with Japan. If you look at the response of the Japanese to different types of disasters, like the Kobe earthquake or even this Fukushima, when Japan has a plan, it usually fails. But if you look at like the Peru hostage crisis, that one, actually Japan did a good job, I think. They were very responsive, they were very fast, and I would argue because they didn't have a plan. What they did was they pulled together the experts, right, like Ogawa Kazuhisa-san and blah, blah, blah. And they said, okay, you guys figure it out. And so when they had a small group of experts that didn't have to, report to anybody, there was no plan, and they were very agile. They said, this has happened, okay, let's do this. This happened, let's do this. And so I think the Japanese actually have very good talent, but the minute you institutionalize it and you create the hierarchy and the process and bring in all the gyosha, it suddenly becomes this thing that's very difficult. So I think that really thinking about this agility is an important thing to think about in Japan. I'll give you an example of an agile process that we had. When 3/11, I happened to be in Boston when the earthquake happened, and my family was in Tokyo, and I had a friend of mine who's a hardware designer, and we said, we're really worried about the radiation, and my house is in Chiba, but we couldn't get any Geiger counters, and we couldn't find any information online. So we said, we need to figure out how to do this. So I quickly called a few friends and emailed a few people, and I found the guy who made the Geiger counters to instrument the measurements after 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl. So he was the expert on Geiger counters, and he was the main manufacturer of high-quality Geiger counters. Then I talked to Jun Murai, who was creating a sensor network in Japan, and then I was able to reach Ray Ozzie, who is the head of who created Lotus Notes and who was a chief scientist at Microsoft who knew a lot about data. And then I found Tokyo Hackerspace, which is a bunch of kids in Tokyo that knew how to solder stuff and make good tools. And within a week, I had put together a pretty great group of experts. And then we said, okay, you know what, we need to get the Geiger counters to people in Fukushima and start mapping this data and putting it on the web so that we can start allowing people to do analysis. So then I went to a website that I've invested in. It's a company here called Kickstarter. And we put up a donation page, said, donate money to get us Geiger counters to send to Japan. So within a week or so, we had $45,000 from that. And then we started finding people that were coming from Europe and America to take these Geiger counters, go into villages in Fukushima and start measuring the data and putting it on the web. Then we had brought a whole bunch of volunteers, people from IDEO and other places to figure out the visualization. And I called the Knight Foundation president. I said, hey, can you give us some money because this is very important. I think open data is very important. Sharing the data is important. The Japanese government isn't doing enough. And so the Knight Foundation gave us $250,000 and we then put that in and started building out the web. And within a month, we had the money. We were all in a room together. We had all of literally the world's experts in all these different fields. Tesla gave us cars. Aston Martin gave us cars. So we had cars. We had 150 volunteers. And we now have over 1 million readings. We have more complete data than any other entity in the world on the radiation in Japan. And now we have a whole group doing food measurements. We've got volunteers in Fukushima. And this all happened it started from nothing. And it was able to move very quickly. And now we're working with all the large institutions. We're working with the government. We're working with Keio and Todai and everybody. But we now have the core assets and the core people to build the best Geiger counters to measure real-time radiation in Japan. And now we're going to push this out to the rest of the world. But the reason I point this out is we weren't prepared. And the people who were prepared still are unable to do anything because they're trying to figure out how to turn this preparedness into action. And even the US government open data guys, once we actually tried to access a lot of their data and it doesn't work. It turns out that when you go to the radiation data network that's supposed to be open in the United States, that through the forums and through the technology, it didn't actually work. And so even that, the planning was great, but no one had tested it. And so again, this very agile system of just pulling together the people as you need them turned out to bring and the last part is I got a very smart hardware guy who's been spending his time in China manufacturing devices, and we now have an open hardware design that any of you can download and manufacture in China, which is probably the state-of-the-art Geiger counter, and we're giving the design away for free in order to try to get more people to design Geiger counters. So, but anyway, that's kind of what the net and the tools that we have are capable of, and thinking about how that applies to startups, but also thinking about how that applies to government policy. And finally, the thing where I'll end is I'm trying to apply that to education. And so I'm completely self-educated. I educated myself on the internet and through people that I met on the internet, and I think personally that education gets in the way of learning a lot. People often go to university to get out of university, to get the degree. And so they don't spend their time in university learning, they spend their time in university figuring out what they need to do to get out of university, which I think is kind of a waste. And so what I told my first year PhD students at the Media Lab is, I said, I want you to learn while you're here. And I want to make sure that when you graduate, if I took away your PhD, that it wouldn't actually lower the chance that you would get a job, that you have grown so much in your work at the Media Lab. I mean, if you were going to become an academic, you need a degree, but I want you to assume that you need to learn so much here that even without the degree, that it will have been worth it. And I also believe very strongly, it depends on your personality, but I think many people learn a lot by building. And I think we've spent a lot of time in this mode of instruction because of a variety of constraints that we used to have. I think there was a scarcity in education because the cost of bringing people together and teaching them in a classroom is very high. So you have to pick the smartest kids in society and charge them a lot of money to be educated. And you have to scale it in a system where you have one professor. That with the internet, that's kind of an artificial scarcity now, because suddenly you can actually reach every student on the internet. You can scale things a lot more. And we're actually, I think, in much more of a world of abundance than we used to be. And I think the idea of causing scarcity or managing education as scarcity is something we need to change. So one of the things I'm trying to do is change the Media Lab into much more of an open network, where we're providing the ability for people anywhere to participate in the Media Lab. We'll still have scarcity of the degree, but I want everyone to be able to learn from us. So we're going to be publishing more of our stuff on the internet. We're going to be trying to create networks and things like that. But I do think that there's a couple of things I'd like to change, is to allow a little bit more learning through creating, a little bit more learning through doing. And very much like I was saying, instead of sitting around and planning and talking about stuff, the kids at the Media Lab learn by building stuff. So the fundamental thing at the Media Lab that's different than in many institutions is we don't focus on papers and we don't focus on the academic part as much. We focus a lot more on rendering things into physical or software stuff that you can see. That helps a lot with interdisciplinary stuff as well, because it's very difficult to get a sociologist and a physicist to agree theoretically on something, but if they're forced to work on building something together, suddenly their ideas kind of mesh. So again, doing something rather than talking about it is another ethos that I think will help with learning. But with that, I think we will switch to Benjamin. Thank you.
So I'm going to try to provoke Joey on a couple of subjects to talk about this information environment we're now in, and then we'll have some questions. I want to put this in the context of the Geiger story you just told. In my book, I have an anecdote about a woman who, I believe she was working in the rental furniture business. And she was very early to discovering the internet, and she was engaging with her clients on the internet, and she was trying to do renting and transactions over the internet. And her bosses were furious with her and said, basically, we won't accept any transaction unless it's faxed. Mm-hmm. And at a certain level, that was about control, that the bosses could see everything she was doing, and they were nervous that she might be doing things that they didn't know about, which gets to the notion of sort of information as power and information as control. I've often thought that in Japan, in many institutions, information is brokered, whereas in the world you come from, and which we're all moving into, information is essentially free. How do you think Japan makes this transition? And I'm curious, for instance, what was the attitude of the institutions in Japan to the Geiger counter work, the health ministry,
yeah,
et cetera?
Well, the reaction in Japan has on the Geiger counter stuff has been dramatically shifting over time. Initially, no one wanted to talk to us, and it was just me and a bunch of gaijin who were just doing something random. But now troublemakers. Yeah. But once we to be honest, at the beginning we really didn't know what we were doing. But because we were open and we were sharing everything on the internet and everywhere else, a lot of people started to contribute their information and make comments. They would say, this is wrong or that's wrong. It's very much like Wikipedia. No, that's not how you do it. You do it like this. And then we go, oh, okay, that's interesting. But if we hadn't published it, we would have continued to do it wrong and the problem is I find a lot of the local governments, a lot of the groups doing stuff in Japan are doing it wrong, but because they're not sharing it, they don't know that they're doing it wrong. And so this is, again, the success of open source and open knowledge, I would argue, is that the old way is you would try to find the world's expert and ask the world expert, what's the truth, right? The way you do it on the internet is you post it on the internet and everybody beats it up. And if it survives, it's likely the truth. And this is assuming that anyone who cares about it will see it. But it's two completely different ways to get to the truth. And and also the notion of control. I mean, what we find on the internet is that when you try to control something, it turns out that it's much more complex than you realized and that you fail. And in economics, we know that you can't control it, right? We know that Soviet Union failed at control. And we're learning more and more that politics, and you know more about China than I do. I mean, China and Syria are so far, I don't want to clump them together, but there are certain places where control seems to still work. But generally speaking, if you look at Arab Spring, it's asymmetrical. The amount of money that, say, Mubarak put into trying to do control and the amount of money it took to overthrow him, it's completely different. Disproportionate. Yeah. And so what I would say is that what we're finding is that control might have been nice when it was simple. World was simple. World is complex. Control doesn't work. And also, open is a great way to find truth. And so to get back to the Geiger counter story, and we'll be making a few announcements in the next couple of months, but the largest Japanese institutions are now coming to us for help because they see that we actually know how to do this. And so we've got, everybody wants to use our stuff, and Geiger counters are hard to make. You know.
So what I want to go in two directions at the same time. So quickly on this. So is the a favorite word of people like you, people in the Valley, is scalable. Is this model scalable in other fields in Japan, do you think? Or does it require a tsunami, an emergency for, if you will, the civic spirit, often from foreign communities to get involved?
Yeah, I think that it's a good question. I don't know. I mean, the thing that's interesting was that the people that we went to were so distressed. So my favorite story is we would go into these little towns in Fukushima where the government would have come in, measured everything, and left without telling the citizens what the data was. And this was like psychologically so disconcerting for these people. And we would come in and we would measure everything. We would tell them, and we would sit and explain to them, this is what it means. Here are the websites. You can figure out for yourself what you think about the risk. And oh, and by the way, let me check your house. Oh, the third floor where your kids are is very high because the cesium is stuck to your roof. You should move them to the first floor, and let's move this dirt away from the drain pipe because this is like 10x. I mean, so once you do that, the citizens start realizing, wait a second, you're doing more for me than these government people did. The government people were following rules. They weren't being mean, right? And so then what happened is, what was really amazing, is that the Fukushima people got together and they set up a citizens group. And they said, okay, you, and we were mostly Gaijin at the time, a guy from Bulgaria, a guy from Netherlands. They said, you Gaijin came and you helped us, and you've really, and now we've created, and we've learned a lot since then about decontamination. We're going to create a nonprofit so that when this happens somewhere else in the world, we're going to go and we're going to say, we're from Fukushima, we're here to help. We know what's going on. And to me, that this kind of citizen to citizen thing, I mean, it's like, the American embassy loves this story, right? Because it's going to be like the speech that you'll hear next week. It's really the people of Fukushima embrace these people who are coming in, and I think partially that would not have happened if it weren't for the distress that they were in. Because typically when like foreign nonprofits or like Greenpeace or people come in from the outside, they're not allowed to have that much influence, but I think this was a special case. I'd like to see this then turn into a model of collaboration where Japanese local people are looking to the rest of the world, because that's one of the things that I thought was great about this, is you've got this hyper-local thing going on. So now some of these little companies in Fukushima want to start building the Geiger counters there, and we're helping them with the design. So there's this amazing collaboration going on between experts around the world and local. Unfortunately, for some people, we're bypassing a lot of the Japanese layers that should have taken up that.
Sure.
But anyway.
Sure. So it's unfair to compare Egypt and Japan, but Japan has labored for many years with lousy economics, social instability, enormous popular discontent, and the citizenry has never kind of risen up and seized back its government, so to speak. What keeps Japan from having an Arab Spring, so to speak? And do you think the internet plays a role in this? And do you have a feeling that the technology, the availability of this new technology in Japan is changing the social and political fabric?
I think it can. I mean, so there's a very interesting set of blog posts. So when the Iran revolution, not the revolution, failed revolution, when the Iran election was happening, the Arabs were watching that. And
Sure.
there were a series of Arab blog posts saying, our brothers across this pond are getting this upset about a rigged election where we don't even have proper elections and we're sitting here doing nothing. And it was really interesting reading that, because I was living in Dubai and I was really looking at it. And that was part of the sentiment that started to get these people. And courage is actually contagious, even in bad ways. So the London riots are also an example of courage. But I think that that there definitely is this kind of global network of young people who are starting to say, hey, wait a second, we can do something. And if you look at a lot of the studies of Japanese, I read, this is a while ago, but like Yomiuri Shimbun did this, but a study of Japanese, typically when you ask them, do you think you can make a difference? And usually the answer is no.
Oh.
They feel very disempowered. But I think that watching these other things happening around the world should at least start to make young Japanese feel like, hey, maybe we can do this too. I still think that the Japan, because of its complexity, is really hard because you don't really know what to do, even if you could do it. And I think that's the tricky part. Even somebody like me, I spent probably 10, 20 years really trying to do stuff inside of Japan, but the complexity just became, I realized that you couldn't really, there was no place you could push as a person to actually get anything to change. So then it becomes the tricky part, which is it the overthrow of the whole thing? Because changing the politicians doesn't work, right? Rearranging the bureaucracy names doesn't work. I mean, what is it? How do you fix Japan? It's really, really hard problem. And so to me, that's actually, even if you got all the young people in Japan to say, hey, we can change Japan, the question is, okay, what is it that you would do? And maybe you have the answer to that.
It sounds like a good topic for a Benkyokai, though. Because I am one of those who believes that Japan is in need of fundamental reform. And I actually want to bring up a third question then before we get to questions. In my book, I use the metaphor of hikikomori, of those who isolate themselves for years at a time in their rooms, afraid to go out, as a metaphor for some of Japan's contemporary problems. Because the traditional argument was someone who sits alone in his room is either mentally dysfunctional or lazy. And what I actually found is actually a lot of these kids would be hackers in a different culture. Yeah. Very entrepreneurial, very intelligent, very energetic, but have no place to go in which they can be different. Yeah. And I hope and have hoped that the internet, the arrival of the internet as a powerful force in Japan might help create room for, if you will, the dissident or the different. Right. But embedded in that question is also the question, which we have in the West now in the internet, about trust, social trust. Who can you believe and who can't you believe? And one of the things I have seen in Japan is that the question of social trust is mediated very differently in a very homogeneous society than in a heterogeneous one, where we have to figure out who the other person is and very quickly get to know whether or not we can change them. What are your thoughts about the question of trust in the internet? We have, on the one hand, concerns about hackers and identity theft and fraud. On the other hand, we see the enormous potential for economic development and growth the internet brings. Is there some mediation point here, or what are your thoughts on that challenge?
So I'll answer that, but I also want to get back to the hikikomori thing for one sec. But
Sure.
but on the thing about trust, so trust is important, but I believe so strongly that this idea that everybody should use their real name and be identifiable, that's such a local, arrogant thing for Americans to say, because that may be true if you're trying to get people not to, write spam or write nasty comments on your blog. But in the Middle East, in just about half of the countries, I would guess, other than a handful of countries, there are cases where you have to be able to communicate anonymously. And every decision that we make in the United States or Japan to create tools that prevent people from having anonymity, or Facebook and Google implementing real name policies, these affect the ability for the Egyptians and the Syrians and the Tunisians to have a dissenting voice. In most countries, you cannot criticize those in power without fear of retribution. That's a fact, right? And the other thing is, the minute you start censoring things for copyright or for trust, because trust, by the way, the lobby that forces this question that you're saying is the copyright lobby. It's Hollywood trying to enforce their copyright, and it's also brands trying to enforce against trademark. That's the money that gets Congress to pass bills that basically go after these people.
But in Japan, we also have the problem of ijime, of internet injime, if you will, internet bashing.
But there are ways to solve that in different ways, and so I would argue that this argument it comes from a very financially motivated, very Hollywood-centric thing. And that it's really kind of a balance. Are 10 dead Syrians worth more or worth less than $1 million worth of stolen CDs to me? Okay, and then to get to the point of sort of ijibe and hikikomori, this is actually a really interesting thing for me, because I've thought about it a lot. Because as a child, I remember thinking, what's my purpose? And I was, bullied as a child. And I remember, I really wish I had a purpose. And at the same time, I have a kid that works for me in Syria. He was recently shot. He's been in jail 3 times. He's been tortured. And, I was talking to him, and he's full of energy. He's fearless. And he's, I was just in jail, and we were being beaten by the same guy. And we were 20 or 30 people in this little cell, all stacked on top of each other. And I was using a farmer's foot as a pillow, and we were all talking all night long. And, we came out, and we are now so solid together, and we're so fearless, and I know exactly what I need to do. And he's I wouldn't call him happy, but he's extremely, he would never commit suicide, and he would never become hikikomori, right? And so while it may seem like the Syrians are going through this really terrible moment, there's an enormous amount of courage and power that comes from the courage. But when you live in a society where you don't really have to do anything to be fed, your parents feed you, and you don't really have a purpose, then suddenly you get into this very weird situation. And it gets back to the original thing is when you don't know what to do to fix your situation, it's a lot worse than having to struggle to fix what you do. And I think that's kind of and a lot of people don't have sympathy for that. They're like, you've got everything. How could you be depressed? And I think that Japanese also don't really recognize mental health problems very well. That's another problem, is so that that gets untreated, and it's like, oh, you're just a spoiled brat. Like the hikikomori kids get that a lot. It's interesting because a lot of them actually work for companies that I've had. There's one kid that worked for one of my companies who was hikikomori, hadn't left his room in years, and he was designing software for us, and we would start sending him money to his bank account, and his parents said, what are you doing? Are you hacking into computers? And then we were like, no, he's working for us. And some of these kids are actually, interesting. So I think that, but it's difficult. I think it ties into the same problem, is when you make the world so complex, it really makes it difficult for individuals to know what to do.
Exactly. And I would also say that Japan is not a very good society at encouraging people to think about being an individual and the struggle for meaning as the sort of the Maslow's law question of how we find happiness as our society gets wealthy. Let me open the floor now for questions from this audience who's been incredibly patient.
And it does change the way people look at the world. But we're now having these, getting back to my original thesis about the cost of innovation going down, that's also happening in hardware. So you've got 3D printers, laser cutters, and things like that. And there's this movement called hacker spaces, which are these sort of co-working spaces that kids are building that have all of this prototyping, manufacturing, design equipment. And they're popping up all over the place, like inner city Detroit, Philadelphia, just Brooklyn. There's a bunch of them around here. They all communicate with each other, and they share best practices. And a lot of kids are going there who or drop out of school or just doing whatever, just building things together. And they're teaching each other. And this is, I think, a really important type of education, which is peer-to-peer learning. And when you go to these hacker spaces and you watch these kids sort of building things and learning and going onto the internet and downloading schematics and messing with them, there's an incredible amount of sort of grassroots ingenuity happening in the world today. And this isn't what, I mean, Steve Jobs was very much he was in a different era, and what he was learning, I think, was very interesting. There was a lot of it at Xerox PARC. What I think is really interesting to learn today is how much you can do with so little, because this will dramatically change the way you look at your business as well, which is you see an uneducated, 2 teenagers that can sit down and build a very sophisticated device now by downloading the information from the internet and working on it over the weekend. And then you look at your company, you say, why do I have these very experienced people spending a year doing the same thing? And this is a lot of what the open source movement taught a lot of people. So that, I mean, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but the Media Lab is kind of where a lot of these prototyping ideas and technologies get designed, and then we're now connecting with a lot of these grassroots hacker spaces. There's even one in Egypt. And it's amazing because the internet allows them to communicate with each other, which is also is fascinating because it's become a really very sophisticated global movement. So I would visit your local hacker space.
Next question.
Just briefly speaking about your background, I know that you've been all over the world, many experiences. what were certain things that you've experienced in the past that you thought you might not be able to overcome, but for some reason you found a way to overcome? What was it? Mentoring, learning, or just from your past experiences? Maybe if you could share that.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of tough times, but I think, well, the more recent ones, I mean, basically is just failing. You know, I think that the fact that I started early, I started my first company I was 18. And I think for 10 years, I probably started 10 companies and none of them were successful. And I thought I'd never be able to be a successful business person. I wasn't in me. And then, but I may be stupid, but I'm trainable. And after 10 years of doing it over and over and over again, I started to kind of figure out how to do it. And, you know, I think there are certain, like my sister is completely different from me. She's double PhD, magna cum laude, Harvard, straight A's. So she was able to sort of see the future and then just go through school, and the formal education system worked perfectly for her. I just, that didn't work for me, and I think it depends on your personality. For me, I just, when somebody says, don't go there, I have to go there and fall before I actually learn it. So I think it depends on your personality. The other thing that was hard for me, this is just a personal, very personal thing, is, you know, growing up outside of Detroit in the 70s and 80s, I had a lot of racism against me as a Japanese kid. And until junior high, I lived in the United States, and I felt really, I had no self-esteem. I thought I had a very terrible time. And when I moved back to Japan, to Nishimachi International School, suddenly the kid who could speak English and Japanese and pretend he was Japanese when he wanted to be and pretend he was American when he wanted to be actually was the best kind of cultural category to be in. And if I hadn't moved back to Japan and gone to Nishimachi that year, I probably would never have gotten my confidence back to actually be able to take risk anymore. So it's just, to me, that was a really essential, a key pivotal moment in my life. And I worry about people who, like you're talking about cyberbullying and things like that. I mean, people whose self-esteem is bashed out of them. And I think a lot of educational systems do that too. It doesn't have to be things like racism. So I do worry about kids going through their junior high school period, because that, to me, I think is a critical period in your development, is kind of building enough self-esteem through your junior high to feel the freedom to be creative. Because I find a lot of the problems with some of the Japanese entrepreneurs that I'm mentoring is that somehow it's been beaten into them that they're not smart enough to be creative. So they stop thinking about, like, if you're sitting in the bathtub on the weekend and you come up with an idea, the difference between an entrepreneur and somebody who's not is, oh no, this can't be an original idea. What am I going to have for dinner? Or I'm going to stay up all night and try building this thing. You know, and that has a lot to do with this kind of confidence that you build in junior high.
Here and then here.
Hi, I'm curious about your thoughts on collaboration technologies. I've been interested in that since the 70s, and it seemed to me the potential is huge, but the big limitation that I find is that there's so much noise, particularly as you scale, that there's so much stuff that's irrelevant and low quality, and the challenge is how do you filter it and how do you identify the good stuff. And it seems like some of the things that might work are better reputation systems where people vote on who's making good contributions and bubble them up. You see a little bit of that in, like, Facebook likes at a primitive level. Things like Slashdot do a little more, but it seems like it would be very easy to get much more sophisticated about ranking things based on reputation and relevance in specific areas and such. And I'm curious, what are you seeing happening there, and where's the potential?
So I think there's a lot of potential. I think that what's interesting is if you look at all the social networks, they're basically online versions of the personalities of the founders. So Friendster was this designed by a lonely kid in Canada, and LinkedIn, Reid Hoffman is probably the most efficient business guy I know. And Facebook was some kid who thought that everybody should know the relationship that everybody else is in, right? And then another thing I would say is, like, for my companies, I never allow my entrepreneurs to buy accounting software until they can do it by hand, because you get the mistaken idea that you don't have to learn accounting if you have software that does it. And what I realize, and this is what I'm doing at the Media Lab, is I'm getting into the weeds right now before I delegate and before I automate. And what I find with information right now is because the systems don't work very well, it's good old-fashioned human networking. My best content comes through email and tweets from people I trust. So when the Iran stuff is going down, I have my instant messenger and my Twitter is like a virtual newsroom. I've got the people from BBC and Al Jazeera and the State Department. I've got everybody on Skype and on all these. And so when I'm trying to figure out what's going on, I ask this guy, I ask this person to find this person, and it's all very human networky. But what's happened is you've got all these tools to take what you used to do by foot and by meeting and by phone, and you're doing it online. I think that some of that work can be automated, but it should be automated after you really understand how to do it by hand. And so I think the problem that we have right now is that the tool builders aren't the people who do it. This is why blogging was so successful. Blogs software was written by people who wanted to write blog posts, who also knew how to write code. And the reason why journalism, where you're from, is failing is that the people who write the software aren't the people who write the articles. So what I would suggest is that if you could get a few people who really knew stuff about information, about journalism, about collecting, about getting rid of noise, and they actually opened the black box and built the tool themselves. And this is what the Media Lab is all about. It's about the people who want to build the stuff, building the tools. And so to me, the problem with all these things is if you were to toss it over the wall and to Google and say, we just need a better reputation system, you're going to get a bunch of geeks who have never read the New York Times sitting around trying to figure out how to build a reputation system for the New York Times, and it won't work really the way you would imagine it. So if you have an idea, I think you need to get in the room and sit side by side, and we call this extreme programming and other things. You watch the screen together with the engineer, and you learn enough technology to be able to design it yourself in the way you want it. And then I think if enough people like you build your own systems, then I think we're going to get some really interesting stuff.
Robert?
You had mentioned when we were talking about this unique wet lab, which is now attached to the Media Lab. I wonder if you could expand on that for our participants today.
Yeah, so the way the Media Lab works is that we only have one of each kind of faculty in the lab. And the idea is that we call it actually anti-disciplinary. It's almost like an extreme interdisciplinary work. And the idea is to build stuff. And so one of our graduates graduated and went to Stanford and got a PhD in molecular biology and came back, and he's like, and I'll be right back. And he comes back and says, all right, we don't have biology at the Media Lab. I want to do molecular biology at the Media Lab and expand the definition of media beyond just robots and stuff to include molecular biology. And now we've got a wet lab where we're testing, so his name's Ed Boyden, but he and his team isolated the gene sequence in algae that was photosensitive, used a virus to be able to insert that into nerves, and then in the mouse brain, he can now read and write information to nerves using optics to figure out what parts of the brain do what, and then he was able to use it to inject it into the nerves of mice that were blind, genetically blind, and then make photosensitive nerves, and now the mice can see, and now we're going to be doing clinical trials on human beings soon. But the fundamental thing, which is to be able to take computers and nanofabrication and gene sequencing and a wet lab to the Media Lab, it's all kind of the same thing, which is let's pull in whatever we need in that kind of the power of pull, and then just build it and be very agile. And again, you could probably do this in a typical medical institution, but it would take a lot longer. And then you'd probably have to apply for grants, and people would say, why are you doing this? And the other great thing about the Media Lab is that we just have unrestricted funds in the core. So any crazy idea, we can just go ahead and do it, which is also another key thing about being agile is if you have to sit and write a proposal to somebody who doesn't really understand why you're doing it, it's like my Wikipedia example. It's the best ideas will never get funded. And our whole purpose is to invest in the craziest ideas, although his would have maybe been funded anyway. But the idea is that anything that we don't have, so we have by the way, we have a faculty search going on. So if anybody go to the faculty search page at the Media Lab. We're looking for anybody who's interested in video games and food and arts and performance. Anything that we don't have at the Media Lab, we're interested in.
And we have time for one Agile More question. Way in the back.
Hi. I'm curious, when organizations visit the Media Lab and then try to take back some of what they see, what do they get wrong most often?
I think that the organizations that get it right take away the DNA of the Media Lab. I mean, the Media Lab is really about a process and it's a way of doing things. And what we're doing is actually not nearly as important as the way we're doing it. And to us, it's actually would be the more institutions that did things the way we did, the better it would be. Because what we're trying to do is create a way of thinking, and we'd love to collaborate with everybody else. So what I really want people to do is come to the Media Lab and say, hey, let's steal the way they do it. And then it creates a bunch of people who, and the other thing is that, the Media Lab is really a bunch of misfits almost, where when it was created, it was all these different people that didn't have a department that actually really worked for them. And so the way that you get it right, I think, is to figure out that the important stuff can happen by bringing a bunch of misfits together and giving them the freedom to try things. I think the people who get it wrong are the ones that go and ask us what patents we have,
All right. I'm duty bound to end at a certain time, so I want to thank Joe Ito and Devin Stewart and the Japan Society for bringing us all together for this afternoon. Thank you all very much for being here.
Thank you.